to help your employees deal with racial trauma. There needs to be punishments for those who are enacting perpetual harm and who are doing these things to employees. We often say, well, that wasn't their intent, all of those things. They didn't intend for that to happen. They didn't mean it in that way, but it still caused harm. You wouldn't say that to someone who was sexually harassed on the job. They didn't mean to do that. They didn't mean to touch your butt. They didn't mean to violate your personhood. Well, the same thing is said, and not to compare sexual assault to racism. I hate to get in those struggle wars, but touching my hair, that is assault. The same way if you violate a person's body, and that person would be reprimanded in the workforce. But if someone touches my hair, they're most likely not going to be dealt with in the manner that someone who maybe violated a person's body. So we need to change that.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Legacy Speaks. My name is Sierra Hillsman, licensed professional counselor and emotional wellness coach. Here, I'm excited to have an amazing conversation with the Ashley McGirt-Adair. She's a speaker, author, and therapist, and we're going to get into a number of things in relation to racial trauma. But before we dive right in, I need you to hit that subscription button below. That way you can stay up to date on newly released content on a regular basis. So here we go. Ashley, thank you so much for being here. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much for even having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Ashley, can you let the people know a little bit about you, who you are, the things that you do, all things in relation to Therapy Fund Foundation?
Yes, definitely. So I am a clinician by nature. I'm a social justice advocate, an avid traveler, a family-oriented person. I love turtles. So that's just a little bit about me that makes up the core of who I am. But really why I do this work is largely in part of my grandmother, who passed away when I was extremely young. And so my grief turned into major depression, and there were no clinicians of color around when I was growing up. In my neighborhood, I grew up in a predominantly white neighborhood, and I ended up having to educate the counselor who I was seeing at the time, a white woman, on what it was like being a Black child in America. At the time, I actually wanted to be a lawyer, and then just as I grew older, I was like, there's got to be other Black people feeling what I was feeling, and we shouldn't have to spend our time during session educating white clinicians on our culture. And that's really kind of the long story of how I got into this work. And most recently, during the pandemic, I founded the Therapy Fund Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that provides free therapy to Black people. We started in Washington State, where I'm from, and we're creating a pilot program in San Diego, and we hope to eventually expand across the entire nation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your honesty and your transparency in this moment. I love asking fellow clinicians, how did they end up in this particular work? And so thank you for taking your experience and creating a foundation for your career. Speaking of career, you have done a number of things within the racial trauma space. And for any individual who is listening for the first time, this is probably their first time hearing that particular phrase. Can you please unpack that for our listeners?
Yeah, racial trauma is now the latest buzzword. I want to say maybe 2 years ago, during the height of the pandemic, the APA, the American Psychological Association, just recognized the impact that racism has on our mental health. Meanwhile, Black clinicians had been advocating for this for years, which is why we had to break away and create organizations like the Black Psychological Association, ABPSI, Black clinicians of color, and all of these other groups, because the overall field was not recognizing the things that were impacting us as a community. But since we are now using this word, what is racial trauma? It's very similar to PTSD, but it's unique in that it is constantly occurring. There's currently no fix for it right now, unless there's some miracle or act of God where racism will end tomorrow. but most likely we're not going to see an end to racism during our lifetime because of all of the policies, all of the things that need to be changed in order for that to occur. But racial trauma is an emotional impact that individuals of color experience in regard to instances of racism, whether it's real or perceived. Macroaggressions, microaggressions, and all of those things have cumulative effects that actually lead to things like high blood pressure, fear, hypervigilance, shame, guilt, even physiological reactions. With our youth, I'll see a lot of nosebleeds because oftentimes the babies don't have the language to articulate what it is that's actually going on. Racial trauma is Tyree Nichols. Racial trauma is George Floyd, Sandra Bland. Racial trauma is your coworker asking you to lead the diversity department because you're the only person of color. Meanwhile, you work in IT. Racial trauma is someone touching your hair without asking, touching your person. Racial trauma are those little slights that still have an impact on your day-to-day. So whether big or large, perceived or real, it has an impact on your psyche. And when I talk about racial trauma, I do like to let people know that it is not an actual mental illness. It's not a diagnosis. It is not in the DSM. It is a normal response to racism. And I often compare it to grief because grief is a normal response to loss. So when I shared earlier how I experienced grief from the loss of my grandmother, but then that later turned into major depression, the same thing can happen with racial trauma. You can have the response to it, which is racialized trauma, which then turns into things like major depression, anxiety, all of the other things that are actual diagnoses within the DSM.
Thank you so much for clearly articulating that and laying that out for a number of individuals. I know for me, I started unpacking my journey with racial trauma, like you mentioned, 2 years ago, when I was dealing with trying to process everything as a clinician and witnessing all of the different losses with George Floyd, all of the things that were happening within the media. And I remember around this time, literally, I walked into my supervisor's office and we were sitting down and we were doing our annual review. And I had came back because I was sick at the time. I had came back and my fellow colleagues, they told me that our team had not even addressed what was taking place. Mind you, I was in a community of a number of Black clinicians and upper management, predominantly white. They did not address anything. And so here I am listening to all the things that I need to improve on and all the things that we can do moving forward, but nobody was addressing the mass grief that we were feeling as a collective. And I broke down and cried in that moment. And I was just like, what am I going through? Because I'm used to being able to compartmentalize everything that I was experiencing. And so can we talk about how companies can address ways to make sure that racial trauma is not perpetuated or normalized within that particular culture?
Well, for one, they can start with naming it. And I know it is a very new term, a very new name, but it's an old concept that has been around since before I've been alive, since racism began, since the institution of systemic oppression was embedded within the founding country and even beyond, because when the formation of America came over, it was borrowed from the British colonies and then the racism that was over there and beyond. So we have to really look deeply. But as a corporation, I know that those are big terms, those are big things to acknowledge, but again, just start with naming it. Name racial trauma and then have a policy surrounding it. The same way we have policies around sexual harassment, we need to have policies around microaggressions, racism, and other discriminatory acts that really create an environment of racialized trauma that cause extreme harm. And I know most companies I think all, because it's federally mandated now, will have that blanket no discrimination policy, but racial trauma specifically needs to be named, and we need to have supportive outlets for those who are experiencing it, places where employees can go for healing. We need to have some sort of employee wellness program, because oftentimes clinicians of color do not take insurance. So while you may be an employer who offers insurance, clinicians may not be able to receive the help that they need if they cannot find someone who represents them from that particular insurance company. So I think an employee wellness fund that they can use at their discretion and pay out of pocket to whatever provider they seek to go to, or even for community healing circles. Those are things that are not covered by insurances. Bringing in someone to your workplace to actually have a healing circle. I've done this for a number of organizations: Amazon, Microsoft, Lockheed Martin. I was getting called on so many times, especially during the height of the George Floyd protest, even before that. But I will tell you, my phone rang way more during the pandemic, because employees, corporations were recognizing, hey, our employees are hurting, and nobody's saying you have to be the expert, but they called in the experts who could come in and help. So have a fund for that. Because this is work. I do get compensated for doing this work. And oftentimes what I'll hear from other organizations is they want me to come in, but there's no budget for it. They didn't plan for it. There's no support system in place. So you need to have a budget. You need to allocate funding to help your employees deal with racial trauma. There needs to be punishments for those who are enacting perpetual harm and who are doing these things to employees. We often say, well, that wasn't their intent, all of those things. They didn't intend for that to happen. They didn't mean it in that way, but it still caused harm. You wouldn't say that to someone who was sexually harassed on the job. They didn't mean to do that. They didn't mean to touch your butt. They didn't mean to violate your personhood. Well, the same thing is said, and not to compare sexual assault to racism. I hate to get in those struggle wars, but touching my hair, that is assault. The same way if you violate a person's body, and that person would be reprimanded in the workforce. But if someone touches my hair, they're most likely not going to be dealt with in the manner that someone who maybe violated a person's body. So we need to change that.
Hey y'all, it's Sierra. Make sure you head over to shoplegacysbks.com to check out the latest gear. As always, we have the classic Therapy is Dope crew neck as well as tees. So head over to cop your crew neck today. It comes in heather navy, that cardinal red, as well as that beautiful gold that we love to see. So head over to purchase yours, not only for yourself, but also for a friend as well. And we are offering free shipping right now. So head over to shoplegacysbks.com to cop all of your Therapy's Dope gear and check out all the other additional merch as well.
Absolutely. There were a couple of things that you noted that I want to dive in a little bit deeper on, because one, like you mentioned, starting off with naming it, calling it out specifically, because it puts it to the forefront and it acknowledges the fact that this actually does exist. And we talked about like the concept of like the power of acknowledging a thing instead of sweeping it under the rug or being passive about it. And so making sure that we're not normalizing that this occurs, but making sure that like, hey, there are some resources that are readily available for us to challenge it. Once we acknowledge a thing, we can work towards change. And going back to like the concept of making sure that we're looking at the whole person and addressing those needs as well. So thank you so much for the way that you worded that employee wellness program, because a lot of corporations have employee assistance programs, obviously with like the counseling opportunities or pointing you in the right direction for the resources. But how can we make sure that we create programs that meet the needs of every single individual, including their diversity and their racial background as well?
Yes, and thank you for acknowledging that difference between employee assistance and what I named being an employee wellness program. Because if you put wellness at the forefront, that's going to show your employees that you care about them versus you want to assist them. It's like, no, wellness is at the forefront. This is an employee wellness fund, not an employee assistance, because we don't want to assist. We want to put wellness at the forefront and say that it's here. This is how you stay well.
Thank you so much for that. Absolutely. And when we're talking about racial trauma, especially when we're discussing the sense of like identity, how does racial trauma impact our professional identities as well as our personal identities as well?
It can impact your identity in a number of ways. One, you may begin to question your identity. Oftentimes in communities of color, I'll see things where what we call as code switching, where you may have to feel that you have to present yourself in a certain way in how you look, how you speak, how you show up. I currently have faux locks in my hair. I work for myself. Oftentimes, women of color may feel like they have to press their hair or straighten it, or that they couldn't be presentable in a work environment with a hairstyle such as mine in this current moment. So what does that look like? That is how racialized trauma impacts us. It makes us change the way that our hair naturally grows out of our hair. And if you do it on your own fruition, because if you look at my pictures, you'll see me online with straight hair, curly hair, all kinds of things. And we should be able to do it based on what we want, not based on how we think we will be treated in a professional environment. So that is how racial trauma impacts our personal identity. It can cause stress, anxiety, trauma, PTSD, a whole host of things. Really, racial trauma is so insidious and pervasive. We have to address it head on, and we have to do things collectively and individually to maintain our personal identity so that those things don't occur, or we can lessen the implications that actually do happen in response to racial trauma.
That is very key, very, very important. I remember when I first moved to Atlanta and I was on my own job search, and I had gotten the advice of, well, why don't you put on a wig? That way you can cover up your natural hair. And it literally worked. I wore a wig. And then once I got tired of that wig and my natural hair came out, one of the microaggressions that came about was, I wish I could change my hair like you guys do.
Yeah, and not even just hair, name. I think about me. So my name is Ashley, and I have what may be considered a stereotypical white name, not a cultural ethnic name. And my sister, her name is Amini, and we have very similar resumes. Our work is very similar, and she's not called like I am called, but you'll look at our resumes and they're almost identical. Yet I'm being called, and my name is Ashley. Her name is Omni Tatiana Cinnamon McGirt. She doesn't even put her middle name on her resume. She's like, that's just too much. Versus me, being Ashley Shawan McGirt. The middle name can be a little cultural, but I often don't put that on resumes either. Now, of course, I work for myself, but just another example of how racial trauma impacts identity, that you have to change your name, or you can't even put your full name on your resume.
Hey, lovely. Shout out to you because I know mental and emotional wellness is important to you. If it wasn't, you wouldn't be listening to this podcast. But lean in really quickly because I know sometimes it's really hard to create a plan and actually sticking to it. So let's take your mental health to another level. Ever wonder what keeps you from fully executing? Ever wonder how you can build the confidence for decision making? Well, guess what? You're not alone, and I'm here to help. So head over to mentalhealthgoals.com for your free mental health plan. It'll give you practical strategies for addressing your current mental health needs. But first, you got to tap in. So head over to mentalhealthgoals.com to receive your free mental health action plan today. Do it right now. mentalhealthgoals.com. See you soon.
Exactly, exactly. And immediately I think about the number of incongruencies in messaging that occurs, especially in the workplace, when you have managers or maybe even like individuals in leadership say, be your authentic self, show up your authentic self. And we understand that we oftentimes don't get that luxury. And sometimes we deal with like the concepts of like the black tax, or maybe even like we talked about changing our hair or adjusting the way that our name is spelled or going by a specific nickname and things of that nature. And so can we talk about the concept of how do we have the confidence to be our authentic self, or how can clinicians help clients discover who they truly are so that they can have the confidence when they show up in these spaces, in these rooms?
As an individual, you are going to have to look introspectively and do some deep diving on your own, and in order to get the confidence that you can to show up. Oftentimes it's, how are you raised? And that has an impact and an influence on how you show up and how comfortable you are in these environments that may not accept you. I'm a darker skinned person, and I hear all the time all of these stories from other darker skinned individuals who wish they were lighter, or oftentimes bleached their skin, or just had these experiences. I remember watching Tyra, well, gosh, what is it? Top Model. I haven't watched it in so long, but Top Model. And every time there was a dark skinned person on America's Next Top Model, they always had that same story. I remember hating my skin and wishing I was lighter. I never experienced that, but I also grew up in a household with a dark skinned mother who loved her skin, probably too much, could be a little narcissistic. So I never felt that I didn't like my skin or that I wanted to be lighter. And so oftentimes media puts these stories out because I think of America's Next Top Model, and I always wished that they had a dark skinned person who went on there and didn't have that narrative. And I'm not saying anything is wrong with that narrative, but it paints it to be that that is the only narrative for darker skinned individuals. And I never once wanted to be lighter skinned or a white person, again, based on my upbringing, and just things that were instilled in me. So as an adult, you may need to instill in yourself some confidence, look at other darker skinned people, boost your confidence. Clinicians may need to do some work around identity and self-love when they're working with clients who have issues around this area. I would encourage clinicians to take my racial trauma training for clinicians. I usually offer it a few times a year. I'm also in the process of making it into an online course. But for the purposes of this podcast, I do like to always give away, tangible tips that people can take away immediately and start working on. And I would say, as a clinician, you can start by acknowledging your own privileges and continue to do your own work. And that is how we model and teach our clients, creating an anti-oppressive, safe space where community members can come and talk to you. And the same for people who may not be a clinician. You can go to a clinician and get that safe space that you need. You can also find your tribe of individuals who understand what you're going through, where you have that space to debrief and let your hair down and let loose and speak freely. It can be a space in your home, a closet, a prayer room, a meditation room, some space where you can get reprieve from the stressors of the world, because again, racism's not going to end tomorrow. So you have to do something internally to protect yourself and uplift yourself, especially as a person of color, when this world says that Black lives don't matter, that people of color are lesser than, that, when we're seeing people of color being slain day in and day out, how does that impact you, and how can you lift yourself up? For me, that's through Black joy. I try to laugh as much as possible. I try to incorporate all things joyful, but joy for me may look different for you. Joy for me is laughter. Joy for you, maybe, I don't know, walks, going to the gym, spending time with friends, family, just something that uplifts your soul. And find out what that is. And I think that's what we can do. It's kind of twofold. You asked in terms of clinicians and then just individuals and how you can kind of uplift yourself.
Absolutely. I think the beautiful thing about what you just mentioned is, one, take accountability with equipping yourself with the evidence-based research and information that is necessary to support not only yourself, but the individual at hand. That's important, but also partner that with practical and tangible application, because you understand that we can go to a number of conferences, we can go to a number of workshops, read everything, but if we're not putting that stuff into practice, then what change are we actually implementing? And I think the beautiful thing about change is not only does it happen on like a global scale or maybe even a community scale, but that one-on-one interaction is so key and very important. And then, like you mentioned, personalizing what that looks like in terms of like self-care. whether it's taking that walk or maybe even finding things that help to restore and fulfill you. I know oftentimes, we have like the trauma porn on social media, as well as with like the information that we're gathering, but finding ways to make sure that you're tending to your needs. Understand that your story does not end at what's happening with race wars or maybe even like the discomfort of what's happening on the news. Like, you come from kings and queens, you have a rich heritage of people who are inventors, innovators, like game changers. So please acknowledge your entire experience and not just that particular aspect or component. Yeah.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And also know that it doesn't have to be one way. It can be multiple ways, and one way isn't better than the other. I know as clinicians, we often mention evidence-based practices, but we can also go back to our roots, African-centered healing practices, indigenous practices. How did our ancestors heal themselves? How were people healing before Sigmund Freud stepped on the scene? And we know that when the work of Freud was around white Jewish women, that does not necessarily reflect everyone within the community. Oftentimes, we have to follow evidence-based practices from individuals who are extremely racist. Piaget, Watson, all of these different psychodynamic theories that we are taught to treat our clients by. But I think it's important to go back to those indigenous roots, those indigenous practices outside of westernized medicine. And of course, as a clinician under the umbrella of the state in which I'm licensed in, I have to follow certain rules and restrictions. But as individuals, we can try other practices. What does Reiki look like? What does, acupuncture look like? How does this impact your healing and your wellness? And it's not one way or another. And I think in our community and Black community, which I'm a part of and that I can speak to, it's often the church and, just pray about it. But faith without works is dead. You can pray and see a therapist. You can do X and X. It's not either this or that. And I think that's important for listeners to know.
Yeah, thank you so much for acknowledging that, the both and adding that cultural component as well. Absolutely, absolutely. Ashley, can you go into more of what you have going on? I know you have an upcoming conference happening in the month of July. Can you let the people know a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, definitely. We are having our inaugural behavioral health conference and resource fair, which is dedicated toward improving mental health outcomes for communities of color. And I would love to invite each and every one of you. It is going to be taking place in person at Green River Community College, just outside of Seattle. But it's also going to be streamed virtually. So for those of you who cannot attend in person, you can stream it online. We're going to have 9 dynamic workshops from a number of different presenters. I'll be presenting my sought out racial trauma workshop. So that's something that you'll have access to. We also have Dr. Patrice Douglas, who's going to be doing her DSM-5 for the culture. We're going to have presentations around some of those African-centered healing practices that I talked about, and a lot of things around improving youth of color's mental health as well, because that's what this conference is really focusing on. As we reclaim wellness, we want to really prioritize how are we improving the mental health of our youth and our youth of color specifically.
Absolutely. So you guys make sure that you're tapping in with all things Ashley McGirt-Adair. You can follow her at Therapy with Ash, okay? And Ashley, are there any other ways that we can definitely stay connected with you?
Instagram is going to be the best way. That's where I'm most active, at Therapy with Ash. You can also check out my website, join my mailing list, ashleymcgirt.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much on all social media, but where I'm most active is going to be LinkedIn or Instagram. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. Definitely, if you want to learn more about racial trauma, I would encourage you to take one of my racial trauma courses, or of course, attend the workshop, not the workshop, but the conference in July, where I will be having a workshop on racial trauma.
Absolutely. And you already know this podcast is called the Legacy Speaks podcast. And I always ask this question to all of my guests. What would you like your legacy to say about you?
My legacy, I wanted to say that I left something beyond me, something that will live on long past me. And I believe I've already planted the seeds for that to occur in the work that I'm doing. And that is what my legacy is. My legacy is beyond me. We all have to go on and leave this world at some point or another, but I want my works to continue on when I'm gone.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for the amazing work that you do. Guys, once again, if you thoroughly enjoyed this episode, please make sure that you're liking, commenting, subscribing, and sharing. If there's anything that resonated with you, please leave a review and also create a post, tag us, and share it with everybody to let them know that we have more information coming. So once again, my name is Sierra Hillsman, licensed professional counselor and emotional wellness coach. You can stay connected at Legacy SPKS on everything. Once again, I can't wait to see you until next time. And we look forward to having our next conversation. So stay tuned.